I don't have a lag, you have a lag. Sorry about this. If I am somewhat out of sync with my face, if so, I'll remove myself and come back in again. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 9 of Inside the Rookery. Today I'm joined by my birds of a feather, Andy Law and Graeme Davis, and our special guest, Mike Mason, Creative Director for Call of Cthulhu at Chaosium, to talk about bringing horror into your RPGs. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you.
As always, we've had loads of pre-submitted questions from our patrons and the denizens of our Discord server. We'll also be bringing up comments as we go along from the chat. But before that, I will hand over to Mike to give himself as brief or as lengthy an introduction as he likes.
Okay. Hello, I'm Mike. As you already said, I work at Chaosium and I look after the Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG line there. I've been doing that for, I don't know, nearly 10 years, 8 years, I think. 8 years working on Call of Cthulhu. I've been playing Call of Cthulhu since the early 80s when it first came out. And as well as, other games are available, and I have played some of them as well. But I've worked full-time in the RPG industry now for some time. I did freelance before that. When I was working in the real world and then freelance in the RPG world, and then I kind of switched over through Magic into working full time in the RPG world. And I kind of work on I work on every Call of Cthulhu book that Chaosium puts out. Either I write them, co-write them, edit them, develop them, do the art direction and so forth. For most of the books, not all of them. I have worked with Lynn Hardy, who helps out on the line as well as some other great people like Nick Macario, who does all the layout and whatnot. But essentially, my tentacles are in most Call of Cthulhu things. And I guess the reason for that is I co-wrote the latest edition of Call of Cthulhu, Cthulhu 7th edition, with a friend of mine called Paul Fricker. I guess because of that, I got the gig working at Chaosium. That's me.
Welcome to the show. We're happy to have you here.
Yes,
we will jump right into the first pre-submitted question from Kilishandra, who asks, what do you feel is the reason for the enduring popularity of horror RPGs?
Well, I think you just take off the word RPGs at the end. What is the enduring reason for the popularity of horror? Because horror films, horror fiction, horror comics, horror RPGs, horror computer games, so on, are all popular. And have been, Frankenstein was a pretty popular novel back in the day. I think let's go back even further. People love getting together around campfires, wherever they may be, and telling ghost stories or horror stories. Or if you're M.R. James, you'd gather your colleagues together in the university and tell them a Christmas horror story. And we've been doing this for years. We've been doing this since the dawn of humanity because we enjoy it. There are other stories as well, but there's nothing quite like a good horror story to kind of grip you. And I think that's part of the enduring appeal about it. We like, not everyone, but most people like a good, healthy scare, when it's a safe scare, when it's a story and it's not, actually being scared because some knife-wielding maniac is, chasing down the street. But a healthy scare, it's good, it excites us, it grips us. There's a bit of adrenaline there perhaps as well. And there's also a catharsis about it as well. There's that kind of, we get to try out, in our head, mentally, through these stories, we get to kind of vicariously experience situations we would never dream or want to be in, but we get to kind of live through the stories and kind of think, well, in your head, what would I have done, or how, and there's a vicarious kind of thrill to that. The same as kind of going on a, Big Dipper or some sort of, fairground ride, that kind of thing. I think that for me is why people like horror. I think is a certain sense of enjoyment about it.
So I was going to confess this later on, but I will confess it now. It maybe wasn't the best person to be picked to host it. I like host this every week, so it was kind of tough. You were getting me. But I grew up in the 80s, and my mum had a particular aversion to television, so we didn't have a television in the house. So while I've watched Gothic horror and I've read Gothic horror, I was an avid reader as a child. Like, I just consumed books, and I still can just drink in words. I've never actually watched some of the classic horror films that are more like The Exorcist, Carrie, like those kind of horror films, and Nightmare on Elm Street, all of those kind of 70s and 80s horror. And I think partially that's because when I was a kid, I hadn't been exposed to it, and so they were always too scary for me by the time I got to them. And it's quite interesting. I had to, like, Andy will tell you, when we first got together, it wasn't even like, it could be like the mildest horror like genre film, and I would be like scared for days. Like, I'd be able to go upstairs by myself. It was quite pathetic. I have somewhat got over that now, but I'm still very much towards sci-fi. Andrew kept saying to me, "Have you seen Alien?" Sci-fi horror and Gothic horror are my genres, not so much that classic like movie horror of the 70s and 80s.
I think that's. I mean, nobody likes it. Well, most people, nobody likes everything. You know, I'm not a massive. You know, I don't rush to the cinema to see the latest kind of romance film. That's not my bag. But there's plenty of people that it is, and it's the same for horror. You know, when I used to work at Games Workshop, we kind of used to say, you're either into Airfix kits or you're not. You know, and if you're not, then this is probably not going to be your thing. But if you are, you're probably going to love it. You know, so I think horses for courses in that sense. But I mean, I grew up in the 70s. And to be frank, all the horror films you've mentioned, which I have seen, are nothing compared to just general life in the 1970s UK. Yeah. Public information films, The Spirit of Dark Water.
Again, growing up,
turn on the TV.
Oh my God!
And watch the changes. They're terrifying.
Again, growing up without a TV, I would go on holiday to my grandparents, or I'd be at school, and I lived in a rural area, so they'd show us these terrifying films where someone fell in a combine harvester or a slurry pit. And I think it goes along with people who are anxious anyway. You said people don't usually dream or think about these things. I think about all the time. I saw those films. I wasn't worried about myself. I was convinced my brother would die every single day. He'd fall in a combine harvester. He wouldn't be able to, help himself from seeking out the nearest slurry pit and diving in for a little swim. That one where they're flying the kite and they get burnt by the electricity totally ruined my holiday when I was 5. Anyway, I think you do need to get into horror gently and slowly and build up your tolerance. And actually, fairground rides you mentioned are the other way around. Most people I know who are adults now are see the fairground rides I could do when I was a kid. I could do anything. And now I'm no, I can't do them anymore.
So for me, just so I can have dived in a little, I think I agree with Mike pretty much 100%. And I'll add that on the gaming side, because you can firsthand make those decisions when you're confronted with whatever the horror that your particular game is offering you, it does make it that much more visceral. It does give you that much more of a real experience. To use a computer game analogy, because I watched Aliens when I was altogether far too young. Alien, not Aliens. So it sunk into me, and I had a lifelong horror of those little egg sacs waking up. When I very first played the first Aliens versus Predator game, I could not go down a corridor where there was actual aliens. Fine, Predators, not a problem. Bam, 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 bang. Away they go. And I was like, no. Face hugger, I'm out. And in many respects, the role-playing games can give you all of those similar visceral reactions, but with so much more safety, because you are around a table with your friends. Well, hopefully your friends. And hopefully afterwards they'll still be your friends. Horror games can be pretty scary. And that, I think, is for the horror game sides one of its enduring appeals, that you can sink yourself completely into it in a way that you can't necessarily do with a book or a movie, because it's on trammels, it's on rails. You can directly influence what comes next. You are the hero or the antagonist, depending upon the game at hand.
Yeah, I think one of the tropes of not of horror itself, but of the way horror is depicted is people shouting at the screen, "No, don't hide behind the wall of chainsaws. That's stupid," or "Don't do that." And in a horror RPG, of course, you have the freedom to not go down the dark corridor or to make uniquely stupid mistakes all of your own.
Which players always do, because they've got that layer of distance between them and their character. So, and they're always pursuing the adventure. So all of the stupid things that they always shout at in movies for not doing, the players are right in there. Woohoo! Right. It's a book I shouldn't read.
Yeah.
But how many times have you screamed? How many times, Graeme, have you screamed at the screen, "Don't split the party! Don't split the party!"
That's right. Let's split up. We'll cover more ground that way. No!
But I'm the same. If I'm a player in a horror game, then I am first down the cellar, or I will put my hand in the box or jump down the well, because I know something will happen.
Yeah.
And right. Ultimately, that's what I want to happen in the role playing. I want things to happen that make things worse, really, in horror games, because it's more fun.
And that's like the ghost stories, isn't it? Like when you used to go we used to go camping as kids, and people would tell those ghost stories that were the urban ghost stories, about like the person in the car and like the person still behind you in the car, and everyone's like leaning in knowing that it's going to be awful, but you kind of just couldn't stop yourself anyway. But Vagrant has asked, does the easy access to real world horror now desensitize players? And then has followed up with, or am I just blessed with a group of psychopaths?
I think I think obviously everyone is different, and different things will affect people in different ways. That being said, horror is not new. Humanity's been experiencing horror since we crawled out of the sea. To just the same amount as we do now. 100 years ago, there was a fellow called Jack in London who caused a bit of a terror, and going back before then. And I think we all have an instinctive, natural reaction to real horror, and I don't know. I don't think we're desensitized to it necessarily. I don't think so. I think there is a different, as we've already said, there's a different context to a tabletop role-playing game. It's like saying, is every castle, a fantasy palace? Well, clearly not. I'm not. I can tell reality from fiction. We're all able to do that. I think we've got rid of that old chest from the 80s, and I think we understand that this is a media we're engaging with. So I don't know. I don't think people are desensitized to horror. I think horror is still horror.
Do you want to go, Graeme?
There's plenty of horror in the real world, and almost the horror of the media, be it books, films, games, whatever, is paradoxically a safe space from that, because you have that removed from it. There are certain conventions between the writers, directors, whoever, and the audience, and whereas in the horror of real life, as we see every day on the news, all bets are off. There are no rules. There are no limits. As I say, paradoxically, it's a sort of a safe space.
I agree.
I'll go in a slightly different direction, just so that we have a slight counterpoint. Not that I necessarily believe what I'm about to say, but it's worth it for a bit of discussion.
You have a great future in politics.
Let's give it a go. Desensitivity. I would say there are certain things that we no longer find horrific because we're so used to seeing it on TV or anything similar. So that comes hand in hand with a level of desensitivity. For me, the horror, or possibly the fear, that might be a better way of looking at it, that can come from your horror role-playing games often comes from the things you don't know. So the more you've seen, the more you are aware of something, the more you can say, well, it's just going to react like this. I no longer need to be scared because I know that's going to happen. I know that's not going to affect me, and I'm cool. And one of the I've found best ways to bring that insidious horror into your games is to unnerve your players by allowing them to not know what's coming next for something that's expected to be a bit different. It's the classic setup of, here's the normal world. We've now established the normal world. Here's the twist. And that twist can come just as strongly in a world where you feel you're desensitized as it can in a world where you think everything's safe, whether it's folk horror where everything looks safe and it absolutely isn't, or whether it's a dystopian area, and it's still got those little twists that can still leave you going, oh no, so the horror can always lie there. So I agree with Mike and say, yes, I agree that we can do horror ad infinitum, while simultaneously I think that it's worth saying that desensitivity does mean that you need to possibly look at things in different ways.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm on that sorry, Graeme, I feel like I'm on that TV show where you have to find the question that fits the answer, because I've found this question. Arcane asks, what do you find elicits the best response from players? A great big mind-shattering monster reveal, or the insidious betrayal of a normal NPC behaving monstrously?
I mean, Andy touched on, the quintessential thing about horror is fear. And it's the fear of the unknown. There are lots of different things we can be afraid of, but the worst is the unknown, because it's unknown, because that allows us, we are our own worst enemies by making stuff up in our heads. And so when you don't fully show or tell, it leaves room for the imagination, and our imaginations are far powerful, more powerful than any media, which is why you watch horror directors and watch good horror films, and it is show the monster as little as possible, let the imagination do the trick. And so in terms of responses from players, is that's my advice for exactly that, is to leave room for the player's imagination, because I can describe, a deep one, and I can say, I can literally say, there's some deep ones coming out the sea towards you, which is not scary in any way at all. Whereas if I don't use the name of them and I just describe these humanoids and let the players fill in the blanks, and that tends to work far better than sticking a miniature on the table going, this is what you see. What, a little metal miniature? No. Doesn't work.
It also... Graeme, sorry, I think. Graeme, are you trying to come in? Sorry.
Here I am.
Something's wrong with your mic. There we go.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's one of Lovecraft's great techniques was to say, for the sake of my sanity, I cannot describe this creature. I cannot even remember it. And but he nearly always then undid in the following paragraph by saying it was a mass of bubbles about the size of a subway car with green this and purple that. But he at least understood the principle that, if you don't describe something, then the imagination does the rest.
And at an RPG table, every player is different. There might be some like me who literally what terrifies me is very different to what terrifies Andy Law or Andy Leask. Like, I'm such a big scaredy cat, you just wouldn't believe it. So me imagining what scares me is very different to him, Andy Leask, who's one of our, our gaming partner, imagining what scares him. Although in his case, it's clearly words, because as he says quite often, he has a fantasia and he can't imagine anything. So, which to me, pretty terrifying.
To speak to this one directly, it's almost the aliens question, isn't it? Where the corporation and the monster's betrayal balanced off against the alien queen. What was worse, the alien queen or the fact that they had been sent to the alien queen? And I think that's going to speak to the consumer of the media as much as it is about the actual media itself. As Lindsay says, different people find different things horrific. Some people will just say, well, that was expected. That didn't move me at all. Others will say, holy shit, did you see that thing? And that works very well for them. But beyond that, I agree 100% with what Mike suggests concerning the descriptions. I remember quite well somebody getting totally freaked out by, of all things, a goblin, because I didn't tell them it was a goblin. And they were utterly horrified by the thing until they found out what it was, and then that horror dissipated. And the power of knowledge is a tremendous thing, as is the power of ignorance. And using that power of ignorance at your tables can make a significant difference. But one last point on the insidious betrayal and big monster. Sometimes it's great when you can combine them. And indeed, I did do that once, where someone who looked like they were just a normal person most certainly wasn't. And then everybody realized it, and they all went, oh, and that was good.
There's a kind of a classic Sandy Peterson story that he tells no doubt on a YouTube video somewhere, but one of his early games of Call of Cthulhu. There's this kind of getting towards the end, and all the player characters are in amongst this kind of bunch of villagers and all walking down the road, and he just kind of reveals that, you know, they look around and they look at each other and they realize they all you know, look, they've all got this deathly flesh like all the other villagers, and in fact, you know, they're all part of they're all wrong basically. And the players go, no, but we're human. No, you're not. It's kind of like, you know, make it about them as well.
Absolutely, it's about that.
Here's a change in tone. Dread asks, how much do games like Wifrup and the 40k RPGs have to thank Call of Cthulhu for their core tone? And do you agree Event Horizon is a prequel to 40k?
Well, my personal opinion would be that I would agree. Event Horizon seems to me like a great sequel to 40k because you know, it's one of the few films that kind of, you know, has some you know, sense of kind of accurately portraying, you know, the warp, and so yeah, I would kind of buy into that. I think that's a kind of a cool idea. And how much Wifrup and 40k? Well, as I wrote 40k RPG, I'd say quite a bit, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, I've been playing Call of Cthulhu for some years before I started working on 40k, the RPG, and clearly, you know, that's a game about mysteries and heresies and, you know, evil things from beyond affecting, you know, the Imperium of Man, as in, you know, the chap who works down the factory, yeah, clearly that, you know, was for me in the back of my head always kind of a version of, you know, Cthulhu in space, really, you know, changed the name Cthulhu to your other elder gods apply. So yeah, I mean, I think so, and I think you know, Call of Cthulhu, as we all know, was technically the first named horror RPG out there, and I think a lot of games then and since have been inspired by or a reaction to Call of Cthulhu in terms of the horror genre, and certainly, you know, knowing the guys at Games Workshop as I do, as I'm sure you guys do, you know, they did beg, steal, and borrow from a variety of sources to inform them when they were putting games together. I would be shocked if Call of Cthulhu wasn't part of that borrow and steal.
Yeah, I mean, it's well known that I wrote Shadows over Boggenhalf, and in response to a one-sentence brief from Brian Ansell, which was write a Call of Cthulhu scenario for Warhammer. So it goes back that far, and I discovered the first edition in like 1981 or 2, and it was really a revelation because I see it as the sort of first game of the second generation of RPGs, where there was more story and investigation. It wasn't just dungeon bashing. And, you know, all of us, when we were working initially on Wifrup, we had that influence behind us. And as well as wanting to make it the anti-D&D, we wanted to make it a modern second generation RPG with the horror and investigation. And so, yes, we stole shamelessly.
And I think that it's quite clear because it's normal people investigating the worst and not getting support from those around them, and being the only ones with that secret knowledge that they have to then make a decision about. And if they try to tackle it, they're almost certainly not going to survive. And I think that applies equally to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as it does to Call of Cthulhu. And it most certainly came from Call first.
It did, Yeah, I remember when I played my first game in college, you know, the players were excited. Oh, I want a Tommy gun. I was like, yeah, okay, you have one. Good luck with that.
Event Horizon is actually one of the very first horror films I watched, because by then Andy and I were together and he decided he would help me get over my phobia of horror films. But actually the thing that sticks out for me is a really good example of what we were just talking about before, that horror is different for everyone. The scene that never left me is Baby Bear outside the airlock. It's not any of the overt horror. It's not the images of the warp. And even talking about it makes me feel really upset. It's Baby Bear stuck outside that airlock and them trying to save him, which is not necessarily the first thing you would think of when you think of the vast scapes of horror that the warp could throw at you.
No, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, horror is always more effective when it's personal.
Right.
Here's
Absolutely.
an interesting question. Is it right to scare the players without their consent?
No.
No.
I mean, it's a simple. I mean, I say this quite often. Actually, is the game is a horror game, and players are signing up to play a horror game. So there's a certain level of expectation about that. But not every player, and particularly at a convention, not every player signing up for your game may be aware of that. They may have just that was the only game free. They put their name down 5 minutes before the session. They don't actually know what they've signed up for. They just wanted to play a game. So, setting the scene and letting people be aware of the context, and if there is, I mean, there's different degrees of horror, and there's different degrees of horror scenarios. There's the classic haunting. It's a haunted house, the ghost or whatever, but it's not that scary. It's a very and then there's very, very kind of much more kind of on the edge kind of stuff as well available. And when you're heading towards that, I think it's only fair and right to kind of let people aware what they're getting themselves into. It's not for everyone. And also, you're not depending on how you want to take this, you're trying to scare the characters in the game. If I put the analogy another way, you're not actually trying to hack your players to death when you play D&D.
Really?
You're hacking their characters to death in D&D. It's the same Call of Cthulhu. You're scaring you want your characters to be scared. That doesn't necessarily mean the players are. If the player wants to allow themselves to be scared and kind of get into it, that's fine. But that's not the intent in that sense.
Yeah, I find from the player perspective, a horror game is much more of a puzzle, trying to, find out what you're dealing with, how to deal with it, that sort of thing.
When's it going to go wrong?
Yeah.
I'll go slightly further and say that this is, in some respects, a development as well, because if you go back, probably more than 10 years now, but if you go back, no games used to carry warnings in them. Indeed, many of them in their GM sections would say something like, and haha, you could pull the rug out from under their feet and really give them a surprise. The sort of material that when you look back at it now, you just sit there going, that's really creepy and not so cool. And we've come a long way. And I think I can only reiterate what Mike said, and that is, before you start, you have a big, long chat about what you're going to do. And that could be as much as you don't know what's going to come. Are you cool with that? And ensuring that exactly what the parameters are, and also ensuring that if anything does go into an area that anyone's uncomfortable with, they can just quit out, get your safe word or whatever is your equivalent for your gaming table. And these things are nowadays essential, and were probably always essential. It's just in gaming's infancy, nobody really quite realized the damage they were often doing by playing the games that they thought were cool. And for many people, there was no damage done. But back then, there almost certainly was for some people. And that's why nowadays all these books have many disclaimer and make sure you do these things because they're important. Loosely.
So let's talk about a classic campaign. Kilishandra asks, the update of Masks of Nyarlathotep is a thing of beauty. What was your favourite part of bringing that classic campaign back to life?
Well, Kilishandra, thank you very much for the compliment. It took I'm not just speaking for myself. It took certain people in this video call a lot, most of the year to get done. There's a lot of work, so it was great to actually realise that and have that come out. I, apart from kind of project managing the whole thing and being the muggins who sat at the end with everything on their hard drive, kind of piecing it together and making sure it all fitted, and there wasn't a plot hole here that had to be fixed over there. Apart from all that, I really, really, really enjoyed reworking the England chapter, which is one of the main pieces I did in collaboration with some other people. But redoing the England chapter and kind of trying to kind of not only fill some what I thought was a massive gap in the plot. I'm not going to go into detail, but I thought there was a massive gap in the plot, and being able to kind of come up with a way to fill that, but also really kind of looking at the characters, the kind of key villains, the NPCs, and really kind of going beyond just their villains, which is kind of in the original, they're just kind of villains. There's not really a lot of motivation other than they're villains, and kind of trying to come up with some motivations and agendas that weren't necessarily in tandem with the key players. So there was infighting and introducing that as a way for players to lever. I thought was would be present interesting possibilities for different groups, because they could potentially ally with a villain to get rid of the other one, or vice versa, or whatever. And I just thought that would create more kind of dynamism in play and give the players kind of a bit more agency in terms of they're not just cardboard cutout villains. They've got differing agendas, and if the players kind of get into that, they get a lot more out of it. So I really enjoyed kind of like really getting into that kind of thing. I have to say, obviously, I really enjoyed working with the cartographer on the project as well. That was a very interesting and fun experience, and because they were doing some fantastic work. And but as a team effort, it was a really enjoyable thing, to work with Lynn Hardy and Paul Fricker and Scott Dorwood and of course Andy as well, and bringing all these kind of different talents together to kind of work on what is already a great campaign. It wasn't kind of like we weren't fixing it in that way. It was already a great campaign. It was basically a case of how can we take any rough edges off and smooth them over and make it even better. And so that was a pleasure to work on, although it was a lot of work.
And Andy, you've brought it up on a stream before because it's one of your favourite examples of the mundanity of horror, I think. The handout that is that right? Am I just making this up?
I don't know. Let's find out.
Is the estate agent handout.
Possibly, I forget the whole anecdote.
The one where so it's like a house, and you couldn't work out how to do.
Oh
like
no, that wasn't from
Masks.
That wasn't from Masks. That was
okay.
from a different book, and that was trying to figure out how to do a handout for what was effectively just a map of a house. If I could have just made a map of the house and it would have been fine, but I wanted to make it an in-game artifact as much as I wanted everything to be an in-game artifact as much as possible. So I turned it into an estate agent's leaflet with little notes from some of the characters to the character who was living there, who was, let's say, not in the best position by that point. My only regret for that one was that I had to do the text in an actual font because I wanted to handwrite it, largely because foreign editions needed to be able to just select that text and convert it to Italian or Spanish or whatever. So it had to be a font. But other than that, yeah, an estate agent's handout, so that it wasn't just something for the GM to look at, it was something they could then give the players as something that was lying in the house, so that they then had a quick, oh, this is where I am and this is how to get around. And there's a couple of extra little clue details on here as well, which hopefully help towards the end goal of the investigation. That aside, on Masks, I really enjoyed doing the things that were a bit different. All the other little handouts, whether that was photographs or business cards, they're always fun to design. Or doing the little matchbook fold-out piece, I enjoy doing that. And I of all the things to say I enjoyed, the thing I enjoyed most was a quick email with Mike, which went along the lines of, "Hey, Mike, how do you want me to do those?" To which he said, "That's why I employed you. You figure it out." And I was like, "Excellent."
Yeah.
And that's loosely how the handouts in, say, for example, the other book, the estate agent's handout, or the government issue a piece of paper that went up on the wall, which is a complete map for an oil rig. But it was an actual piece that had come from the government explaining the whole thing. And I seem to recall there was a little poster on it saying, I can't remember what it said, something along the lines of, a bunch of idiots or something. I seem to recall. I didn't swear because I wanted to avoid swearing just in case they had a swear filter, but I got as close to it as I felt that I could. And yeah, I greatly enjoyed doing those, and a Mask in particular, but it was an enormous job. There was about 100 and there was a lot of pieces.
And it was a very tight deadline, which leads us on to the little known fact that Andy was struggling so much with the deadline, and I do a lot of calligraphy, that he may have asked me to do the handwriting. So I did I think all the stuff that was handwritten, I did physically with my copperplate pen, with my pencil, and sort of chatted to Andy about what the characters might be and researched what kind of handwriting they would have had, with what education they had, and then gave it to Andy to scan in. So that's a secret,
Scan
little
and
known
tidy.
fact. Yeah.
That was a lifesaver. It was great.
Marvelous.
Yeah.
So I'm the only one here who didn't work on Masks of Nyarlathotep.
Sorry, Graeme. I mean, if I'd known you then, I could have contacted you to write a quick note.
Yeah, subcontracted some other work. And just a follow up to that question.
Peterson's Abomination.
Peterson. So there's some kind of horror. So MCV asks, what do you think explains the success of Call of Cthulhu's Masks of Nyarlathotep or Wifrip's The Enemy within classic campaigns, and could that success be captured again?
Yeah, I think, okay, the way I look at this is that they were the first of their kind. And that's why they had the effect they did, because if you look at in case of Call of Cthulhu, it wasn't the first campaign ever written for Call of Cthulhu. There'd been Shadows of Yog-Sothoth, which is the first campaign for Call of Cthulhu. But we, I say we, they hadn't worked out how to do a campaign, and it was a bunch of scenarios that were kind of strung together with a loose connection through them, but the connection was very, very loose, and so there were really just 5 scenarios that happened to be in the same book and call it a campaign. By the time Larry kind of sat down and said, I'm going to write a campaign, the major difference was it was one person wrote the whole thing rather than 5 or 6 people in different parts of the world all writing their bit and then sending them together and then somebody just putting them in a book. So that was fundamentally different. You had one person who had the vision to say, they start here and they go here, here, and here, and they end up here. And I think that was a key difference to kind of show that how you make a campaign. It's about what a campaign in a mystery sense, in a plot sense, is about the interconnectivity, and especially in a campaign like Masks, where you all start in the same location, but from then you can go anywhere. You can go to any point in any of the locations in the campaign from that starting point. So that kind of non-linear approach in terms of it's where you want to go, was fundamentally different. Was never really been done before in terms of an RPG campaign. So I think because it was the first, that's why it was deemed so successful and considered a classic in that sense. I think Wifrip is exactly the same. It's the first time somebody had taken this a game that wasn't Call of Cthulhu and did it for that game and said, actually, this is how you do a campaign and this is how it works with this kind of tone and system. I think so. They were the first, and I think yes, they can be captured again, but they can't be captured again in the same way, because you can never be first again unless somebody invents a completely, I don't know what it is, but some other way of doing a campaign that none of us have ever thought about, and they reinvent the entire thing. Then maybe that would be seen as a classic and get that kind of thing. However, nothing ever is ever going to be the same as those ones because they were the first. However, if you put all that aside, there are other campaigns that certainly that we've done, the Two-Headed Serpent and Children of Fear and so on, which as a player experience are just as much fun as Masks. They have. I've play tested them. I've enjoyed them just as much as I did when I played Masks. But they're never going to have the same kind of buzz because they weren't the first in that way. I mean, that's my view anyway.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. I mean, apart from the fact that The Enemy Within kind of started out having an arc that was set out, but then various factors intervened and the end was a little different from how it had been planned. But what you said about being the first is important, because then all you can do to capture that success again, so to speak, is to come up with another quantum leap. In between, people are just kind of taking that form and polishing it and doing it, refining it, doing it better. But until you get like the next generation, the next quantum leap, then probably not.
Yeah, I agree completely as well. What explains the success? Doing something new for the first time. And I think that pretty much nails it. And also because it's the only example of its kind, there's a certain universality of experience as well. Anybody who tries it for the first time will go out and say, have you seen this? This is awesome. Have you seen this? This is awesome. Here's the new thing. Where if we look at the market today, it's saturated with so many often exceedingly high quality products, with very good stories that are, I would argue, often significantly better than what came before, because they are polishing and they are refining and they are taking the very good material that they started with and standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak, to create something that is arguably much better, but will, in terms of overall appreciation, almost certainly not be as well received because it wasn't first. It didn't do something new. And often they'll read through it like this and go, oh, that's a little bit like this and that's a little bit like that, not realizing that it's also better. But that's never going to be the case. It's never going to be objectively better for them because they've already done it. So I agree completely with Mike and Graeme's points there.
I think sorry.
No, but please go, Mike. I'll go back to that
I was just going to say that often, as old guys, we'll say all of this because we're talking about our own personal experience. However, if you just started role-playing games, and let's say the first big campaign you play is one of these newer ones, and that's your first experience of a real kind of get in deep kind of campaign that kind of really grips you when you play for a long time and you have this character arc, and I would guess that's the campaign that's going to stick with you as you go forward. And when you're our age, you're going to look and go, yeah, forget about that mask. We played that later on and it was okay. But that first one, do you remember what happened? And they have their war stories. And, so I think there's a certain kind of, age thing as well in terms of, what's the first thing that really grips you?
Absolutely.
It's going to stay with you. So there may be some of these modern ones may have that effect down the road. With people who encourage are playing them first time now, kind of thing.
It's
completely. Go, Graeme.
No, it's just whatever you encounter first is then your frame of reference for everything else.
To use a different analogy, it's like Highlander. Highlander is a brilliant movie if you watched it the first time round. For anyone who comes to it later, not so good. I mean, even going back to it, as much as I don't want to admit it, not so good. Who wants to live forever? Yeah, well, maybe it shouldn't. I'll just sit there sitting in my nostalgia past and being quite happy. And somewhat similarly, much of the stuff that we thought was awesome when we were younger, the material getting created just now is often extraordinary. Of course, it's a big market, so there's some terrible stuff out there too. But it is truly brilliant. And for, as Mike says, the newer generation moving into gaming, experiencing these products, when they go back to the older ones, they'll often go, what? Which is why, for example, redos and revisits and a rework of an old classic is, I think, for games like this, not just a good thing, it's often an essential thing because tastes move on. As do what is acceptable and what's no longer acceptable. There needs to be new advice written in. There needs to be new approaches to sections that are now perhaps problematic. And it is worth doing because a lot of these campaigns are truly brilliant and it is worth revisiting.
Yeah. Plus, if you've got the benefit of 30 years of playtesting and player comments, why not just...
Quite.
Jimmy has asked that this might be a little bit too big to tackle in one stream, but maybe giving Jimmy some pointers and some extra resources he can go and find. So how do you set up a basic horror scene, i.e. from start to horrific reveal? I often feel like I'm struggling to hit the right notes.
Okay. I mean, my advice is to work with your players. And what I mean by that is watch your players. And think back to what we were talking about 10 minutes or so ago about fear of the unknown. Great, present the scene, but don't say, but don't present it all. You present the normality of things. So let's just say, okay, you're in a room, and you describe it's an old house and creaking floorboards, and there's wallpaper peeling off the walls, and the windows are all cracked, and the light doesn't work. So you're seeing this through torchlight, and there's a dim and dust is flying down. and that you've described the mundane aspect of the room, but you've set the scene. It's a bit creepy, you know. Something could happen in here. You can't quite see into the corners. It's a large room, so your torchlight doesn't quite, you know, go to the end of the room. And so, you know, and then you kind of turn it over to the players. Well, you know, what do you want to do? You know, do you want to go in? And then they'll have a 5-minute discussion about who should go in, and then somebody will go in, and then you reveal a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and then, you know, and I'm just being super simplistic. You know, the torchlight finally kind of finds its way. The beam kind of gets into the corner of the room, and they see a shape. And then I'll pause, and I won't say what the shape is because I want the player's imagination to start working now. The shape. I didn't say human. I didn't say a rat. I said a shape. And then you say the shape starts to move. And so what I'm trying to say is you piecemeal give the information to players and with little pauses to allow them to do the work in their minds until you get to the point of revelation where the shape pulls forward, it comes fully into light. You see this pale face. I'm not ever going to tell them the name of the monster. They see this pale shape with these claw-like hands suddenly jumping towards you. What are you doing? And then, you know, and so because once the actual monster engages, it's no longer horror. You're now dealing with a combat, and you're now dealing with players running away, you know, failing sanity rolls or getting eaten or whatever. That's not horror. That's, you know, it's fun horror in that sense of the game. But the actual horror is all the build-up. And so, you know, trying to convey that in that way, as you know, as Lindsay said, it's a big topic, and there's lots of. This isn't the only way you can do it. That's my, you know, rule of thumb is to drip feed, build in pauses, let the players kind of, you know, it's the anticipation. Let that build the tension as you go.
Yep. Yeah, quite. That's the words. I 2 words, in fact: anticipation and dread. Because your players know what they're playing, they know that something's going to go wrong, which means that in some respects they're half looking for it all the time, and not giving them it can really build things up just that little bit more. It's about your reveal coming at the right time, and it's often much later than you think. Because if you do it early, then it just almost undermines the horror, because suddenly they're now dealing with something that's supernatural. To go on a computer game side, if you take a game like, say, Uncharted, which has a potentially horrific ending, with all sorts of zombie creatures doing zombie things, to spoilers, kick around, they build up that for the entire game before they reveal it. It's not done at the first combat beat. It's not done at the second or the 8th or even the 100th. It's done significantly in. And one last one I would suggest is avoid combat like the plague. Combat is the great killer of horror at the table, because suddenly you're moved into a place where you have got codified things you can and you cannot do. There is now a set of actions I can do. There's a set of things I can do. And your brain moves from being in story mode and going, oh, fuck, what do I do? Into, well, now I'm going to tactically do this with this action, and it completely changes the tone. So if you're looking to build horror, I would most certainly suggest that whatever it is that you're building towards isn't something that the party are then going to start shooting at with anything other than terror. Rather than, well, now I'm going to tactically sit around the corner and go bang, bang. It's far better they're just shooting into the darkness because they don't know what's there.
Yes, absolutely agreed.
Yeah,
there
we go.
You reminded me of one other way to do this is to turn player expectations on their head. And a very, very quick kind of story on this one is the players, let's say they're going into the sewers and they're going to hunt the sewer people. You know, they've done all the research, they've found the old newspaper stories, and they basically, they don't know, but they kind of know that in the sewers are the sewer people who are doing all the bad things. Yeah. So they're going to go down, they're going to confront them and sort it all out. We're all good. And yeah, it might be a bit scary, but we know what we're going to find down there. And so you present the scene, you go through sewers, and you find, and then they say, so go through the sewers. They then find a room, some connecting network room, bigger room in the sewers, where all the sewer people live, and they've all been mercilessly slaughtered, and they're all dead. Because then the players go, we thought they were the bad guys. What the hell? And that they, and so you kind of turn the player expectation on the head. That can often inspire a little bit of that moment of players going, "Oh, we thought we knew, but now we don't."
And to take that further in like 40k or even in Wifrip or a game where there is that creeping horror, the outside, the other, but actually turning it around, you think you're safe, you're back in civilization, and actually, especially in 40k, the true horror is the civilization that you're supposedly fighting on behalf of. Like, that's kind of horrific. You think you're safe, and then you see what they do when there's any whiff or any sense that you might have become infected or tainted with the thing that you were trying to stop. I think the bureaucracy of that Imperium is truly horrific.
Yeah, and it's the same with each individual location, because if you've got yourself a story about, let's say, our bog people, not our bog people, our sewer people again, but let's say our sewer people are down there doing their thing, and you built up towards the reveal. Our sewer people are horrible; they've been revealed. You then almost reach a roadblock. How do I keep the horror going here? That's when you put your story twists in. So, for example, the next time they go into the next room or whatever it may be, they go in and then the door locks behind them, and they can't escape this time. And the person that was responsible for that is someone who's part of their team, or whatever is the story at hand, to try and change where the horror is coming from each time, and changing the target. Once you've had that reveal, continuing to focus on that reveal will just undermine that reveal. Now you've done that, you need to move on to something else. The difference between Alien and Aliens, a very different style of movie.
In Drachenfels, where they're looking back, so it's a play about the thing that happened, and everyone thinks they know what happened in the castle because they were all there, but then at the end of the play there's that reveal, and it throws into like everything that happened before, it unleashes this horror, and they all thought they were safe, and we're reconstructing that in a safe way. There is a question here which I guess, how do you fight with players who, in defense of horror, start to make a laugh to release tension or stress?
Okay, that's a great question that I get asked a lot. And my answer is there can't be horror all the time. It doesn't work. It's, you watch any horror film, from the second you start, it's not horrific. In fact, 9 out of 10 horror films, there's no horror till 2/3 of the way through, and then there's none, and then there's some at the end. There's actually two sharp points of horror in a horror film, because you can't sustain it. We just crumble. So you can't do it in the game. And in the game, it is pixie dust. It's magic that happens at the table, and you can do all you can to try and create the environment and create the mood and get the buying of the players, so you're all getting the tone and mood right. And sometimes that mood happens, and it's you all go, "Oh, that was great." However, comedy is a fantastic bedfellow to horror. That's why they use it in horror films, because it works so well, because you relax. You go, it was only him. It wasn't the monster. And then the monster comes, because that's the way films work. But comedy is fine. And okay, this is the other way I put it. Okay, it's a fun experience. We come to play. We're playing a game, and we're coming together because we want to relax and we want to have a bit of fun and we want to socialize with our friends. Okay, and you know what? Some nights there's no horror in us. We're just tired because we've all had a long day at work, a long week of work. We just want to get together with our friends, shoot the breeze, roll some dice, progress the plot a bit. We do a bit of chatting and NPC stuff and research or whatever. But there's no horror tonight, guys, because we're not in the right frame of mind. We none of us actually, we don't want a big combat tonight. We just can't be. It's too much.
And actually, that's kind of an investment, Mike, right? So because I find those sessions, they really build your bonds between characters. So they're building the bonds between your characters. They're also building bonds between you as players. So when you do come to that horror and that peril in the next session or the session after that, there's more stakes, because it's not just, you know, some people on a piece of paper that we roll dice about. Maybe it's just me. I get quite attached to characters, NPCs and PCs alike. But I find those interim sessions where you're building your character and building those connections are what make it really horrific, when you have to, you see those connections are now in peril.
Contrast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a sort of a peripheral point here that has come up in my Twitter's feed lately a lot, is that a lot of people think that a written adventure, or whether it's commercially written or written by a GM, is a script to be followed, and it can be ruined if the players don't play along, or if they do humor when they're supposed to be being frightened or anything. And that's simply not the case. This is a bigger subject for another stream, perhaps, but
Yes.
you know, what you start with is basically a setup, and the story doesn't happen until the player gets involved. Therefore, everything that happens is what's supposed to happen, so nothing can be ruined.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll add my extra little bit on that one as well, and that's that you obviously require contrast. If everything is horrific, nothing's horrific. Obviously, you need to have something to compare it to. And humor is one of the best tools to counterpoint horror. It provides you with those peaks and those troughs. You're going all the way up before you go all the way back down again. And sometimes when players are doing something that you would prefer they weren't, because you've got your big horror moment coming and they're all playing jokes or doing whatever, that's the way the adventure is going to go. It's their adventure. They are the protagonists. And if they deal with something that's horrific with humor for themselves because they find it really amusing, then they're all having fun. That's okay. The adventure doesn't need to come out exactly as you pre-planned it inside your head. And indeed, the more that you're willing to go with the flow and lean into it, the more you can then use that to turn into a really big dip after.
Exactly.
So rather than fight it, as your original question suggested, how do you fight this? You don't. You go with it. You do the flow of the river rather than stand as a rock in the middle of the flow.
And for me as a GM, that's where I get my fun. I'm not just simply declaiming and reciting, but I'm responding and reacting and adapting. And that's where the fun lies for me.
Big GM tips.
The best way I can characterize this is a film analogy with Goodfellas. When there's a scene in Goodfellas, it's a horrific scene, ends horrifically, but it starts as comedy, and they're all laughing, and they're like, "You're a funny guy."
Yeah.
And then the guy just, "What do you mean I'm a
Snaps.
funny guy? Funny how?"
Yeah.
And it's suddenly not comedy. And if you could, and again, it's pixie dust and magic. If you can find that moment and flip it, you'll have a fantastic effect. But you can't do it all the time, and you can't do it every game session.
No.
Yeah, and it's the flip as well with, say, taking the same situation but turn it the other way around with Pulp Fiction, and bang goes the brains, motherfucking brain duty. Turning something horrific into something really funny. It's counterpointing them all the way along, and a strong game will be able to almost whiplash from one to the other without it actually being tonally off. And learning to do that will just come with experience. But I think the big one for me would be don't fight.
We don't have much time left. I was just skipping through all the questions that we didn't get through. That was pretty cruel of me, because now you'll never get those answers, Mike. If you would like to come back one day, you'll be more than welcome to come back so we can get to all the questions.
Yeah, please
Happy
do.
to talk with you guys anytime. Yeah,
Yay.
not a problem.
And just one final question to end with from Martin. Does the orange octopus have a name?
Well, it tends to get called Harold, but he was joined this week. Where I've got why the question is. Normally, my camera faces the other way, and on the wall I have an orange octopus hanging up. But I did find this week, which is a giant squid, which I thought would go well. He hasn't got a name yet, so suggestions on postcards.
Are they jellycat creatures? Our daughter's got loads of them, loads of octopus ones, pink ones and grey ones and turquoise
fantastic.
ones,
Yeah.
collecting them.
Oh, awesome. They're not jellycat, but jellycat are awesome stuff, I have to say.
Yeah, she's collecting those. Anyway, I just wanted to end on, because we've been talking about horror, I felt that we needed to end both on a great beast and also a note of niceness, so I can sleep tonight. So thank you so much for joining us, Mike. Thank you to my fellow Rooks as always. Thanks to everyone who's contributed in the comments and our patrons as always. We wouldn't be able to do this without you. Andy Law, who do we have popping up next week?
We've got Andrew Peregrine popping up. He is the lead writer at the moment on Dune, which many of us will know. And we're going to be discussing how to deploy politics in your role-playing games, something that many games purport to do, but often turn into let's hit it with a big sword, which, as we all know, is just one manifestation of politics.
Well, until then, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week to talk politics. What could be more fun?
Everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.